For most animals, exhaustion is a passing signal, a brief pause before movement begins again. But in humans, rest became something deeper, something that must be returned to again and again, as if our survival quietly depends on stopping. It is a strange evolutionary trade. The more capable the human body became, the more often it seems to require recovery. So why do humans need rest more than other animals? Rest is often imagined as the opposite of activity, as if the body simply turns off when it is no longer moving. But this idea does not match how living systems actually function, because even in the quietest moments the human body continues to regulate temperature, repair small cellular damage, and maintain a steady internal balance. And this ongoing work means that rest is not an absence, but a shift in what the body is doing, a reallocation of energy rather than a pause in its use. And this pattern did not begin with humans, but can be traced back through the long history of life, where early organisms already displayed cycles of activity and reduced engagement, not because they chose to rest, but because their structures required time to recover from the effects of interaction with the environment. And when these patterns carried forward into more complex organisms, they did not disappear, but became layered with additional demands. So that in humans, rest is shaped not only by muscles and metabolism, but also by the constant activity of the brain, which remains active even when the body appears still. And this is where a quiet difference begins to emerge between humans and many other animals. Because while all animals must balance energy use and recovery, the human system distributes its energy across a wider range of functions, including memory, planning, and social awareness, all of which continue to draw on internal resources even in moments that look like inactivity. And if we look back toward the earliest humans moving through open landscapes, we can begin to see how this pattern might have taken form, as they did not rely on short bursts of speed alone, but often engaged in long periods of tracking, observing, and adjusting their movement to subtle changes in terrain and weather. And this required not only physical endurance, but also sustained attention, which quietly increased the cost of simply remaining engaged with the world. And over time, this created a body that was not only capable of extended effort, but also dependent on regular intervals of reduced demand, because without those intervals, small imbalances would begin to accumulate, affecting coordination, perception, and the ability to respond to changes in the environment. And unlike animals whose activity may be more tightly linked to immediate needs such as hunting or escaping, human activity often extended beyond the present moment, involving anticipation and memory, and this meant that the body was rarely operating in a purely reactive state, but instead maintaining a continuous background level of processing that required its own form of recovery. And when rest is viewed from this perspective, it becomes less like a break and more like a necessary phase within a cycle, where the body reorganizes itself in order to continue functioning effectively. And this cycle can still be observed in subtle ways, such as the gradual slowing of reaction time when effort is prolonged, or the shift in attention that occurs when the body begins to signal a need for reduced stimulation. And these signals are not sudden failures but gentle adjustments, indicating that the system is approaching the limits of its current balance. And if we return again to the origins of human life, before artificial light and controlled environments, these limits would have been closely tied to natural rhythms, such as the changing light of day and night, or the cooling of the environment after sunset. And rest would have been taken not as a scheduled event, but as a response to conditions that made continued activity less efficient or more risky. And this connection between rest and environment remains present even now, though it is often less visible, because modern conditions allow activity to continue beyond the natural cues that once guided behavior, and yet the underlying need has not changed. And this is why rest can sometimes feel like an interruption, even when it is actually a continuation of the same process that allows action to occur. And when comparing this to other animals, the difference is not that humans are weaker or less capable, but that the human system operates with a broader range of demands, many of which are not immediately visible. And this broader range requires a more frequent return to states of reduced activity, not as a sign of limitation, but as a reflection of how the system maintains its ability to function across time. And so the need for rest, when viewed in this way, begins to appear not as an exception, but as a defining feature of what it means to be human, rooted in a long evolutionary history where survival depended not only on movement, but also on the careful management of energy and attention across extended periods of life. When rest is understood as an active process, rather than a passive state, the question begins to shift from how often humans rest to why the human body requires this constant return to balance, and one of the clearest answers emerges from the way energy is managed within the body. Because unlike many animals whose energy use is tightly linked to short periods of intense activity followed by long stretches of low demand, the human body distributes its energy more evenly across time, maintaining a steady background of activity that rarely drops to zero. And this pattern can be traced back to the early conditions in which humans evolved, where survival depended not only on moments of action but on sustained awareness, coordination, and decision-making, all of which quietly consume energy even when no visible movement is taking place. And this creates a situation where the body is never fully at rest in the sense that it completely disengages, but instead cycles through different levels of demand, each requiring its own form of recovery. And when we consider how this differs from many other animals, we begin to see that specialization plays an important role, because animals that are highly adapted to specific modes of survival often have clearer boundaries between activity and inactivity, allowing them to conserve energy more efficiently during periods of rest, whereas humans, as generalists, remain partially engaged with their environment even during quieter moments, maintaining a readiness that prevents energy use from dropping too low. And this readiness is not a conscious choice but a feature of the nervous system, which continues to monitor, process, and adjust in response to both internal and external signals. And over time, this continuous engagement creates a steady accumulation of small costs, not enough to cause immediate failure, but enough to require regular intervals of reduced demand in order to prevent those costs from building beyond the body's ability to manage them. And if we return again to early human environments, we can imagine long periods of walking across varied terrain, where each step required adjustments in balance, each change in ground required subtle shifts in muscle use, and each sound or movement in the distance required attention. And even in moments when the body paused, the mind did not fully disengage, continuing to track, remember, and anticipate. And this combination of physical and cognitive effort created a form of fatigue that was not always dramatic, but was persistent, building slowly over time rather than appearing suddenly. And this kind of fatigue is closely linked to the need for rest, because it reflects not a single point of exhaustion but a gradual shift in the body's internal balance, where efficiency begins to decline and small errors begin to appear. And these errors, whether in movement or perception, would have carried real consequences in early environments, making the ability to recognize and respond to the need for rest an important part of survival. And this is why rest is often accompanied by subtle signals rather than immediate collapse, such as a growing sense of discomfort, a decrease in focus, or a tendency towards slower, less precise movement. And these signals can be understood as the body's way of guiding behavior back toward a state where recovery can occur. And when compared to other animals, the difference is not simply in how much energy is used, but in how that energy is distributed and how its effects are managed over time. Because a system that spreads its activity across many functions and maintains a continuous level of engagement will naturally require more frequent opportunities to restore balance. And this pattern remains visible in modern humans, even though the environments have changed, because the underlying mechanisms of energy use and recovery have not been replaced but only layered with new forms of demand. And this is why rest continues to appear not as an optional pause, but as a recurring need, woven into the structure of human life in a way that reflects both our evolutionary history and the way our bodies continue to function in the present. The idea that rest is something we enter only after reaching a limit can feel natural, yet in the human body the need for rest often appears before any clear boundary is crossed, as if the system is designed to anticipate imbalance rather than simply react to it. And this anticipation becomes easier to understand when considering how many different processes must remain coordinated at the same time, because movement, perception, memory, and internal regulation do not operate independently but continuously adjust to one another, and even a small shift in one part of the system can ripple outward, requiring subtle corrections elsewhere And over time, these corrections accumulate in ways that are not immediately visible but gradually alter the efficiency of the whole. And this is where rest takes on a role that is less about stopping and more about recalibrating, allowing the body to restore alignment between its many ongoing functions. And this need becomes especially clear when we look back toward the conditions under which early humans lived, where the environment did not provide stable, predictable settings, but instead presented constant variation in terrain, weather, and available resources. And navigating such conditions required not only physical endurance, but also a steady integration of sensory information, as the body had to adjust to uneven ground, shifting light, and changing temperatures while maintaining awareness of other living beings. And this meant that even in periods without intense exertion, the system remained engaged at a level that gradually introduced small mismatches between intention and action, between perception and reality. And without opportunities to reduce demand and allow these mismatches to settle, the risk of error would increase, not dramatically at first, but in ways that could affect balance, timing, and decision-making. And this kind of gradual drift is different from the more immediate forms of fatigue seen in some animals, where exhaustion may follow a burst of activity and then resolve after a period of rest. Because in humans, the drift can begin long before any obvious exhaustion appears, and so the signals that guide rest are often quiet, emerging as slight changes in attention, a reduced clarity in perception, or a subtle sense that effort is becoming less efficient. And these signals do not force the body to stop, but invite it to shift, to move toward a state where the constant adjustments can be reduced and the system can reorganize itself. And this reorganization is not limited to muscles or energy stores, but includes the patterns of neural activity that support memory and coordination, which continue to evolve over time even when no new external demands are present. And if we consider how this would have functioned in early human groups, the timing of rest would have been influenced not only by individual needs but also by shared conditions, such as the fading of light or the cooling of the air, creating periods where activity naturally slowed and the opportunity for recalibration became available. And in this way, rest was not imposed from outside, but emerged from the interaction between the body and its environment, forming a rhythm that supported both survival and continuity. And this rhythm can still be sensed today, even in environments that no longer follow the same patterns, because the underlying structure of the human system has not changed at the same pace as the world around it. And this is why rest can sometimes feel necessary even when there is no immediate sign of exhaustion, as if the body is responding to a deeper pattern that extends beyond the present moment. And when we compare this to other animals, the difference lies not simply in how often rest is needed, but in how early the signals for rest begin to appear, reflecting a system that is tuned to maintain stability across a wide range of functions, rather than to maximize performance in a narrow set of conditions. And this tuning, shaped over long periods of human existence, suggests that the need for rest is not a reaction to failure, but an integral part of how the human body continues to function across time, quietly preserving the balance that allows action to return again and again. If rest in the human body is not simply a response to exhaustion but a recurring need that appears even before clear limits are reached, then the next step is to understand what makes the human system so consistently demanding of energy. And this question leads directly to one of the most defining features of our species, which is not visible from the outside but shapes nearly every internal process, and that is the way energy is allocated within the body. Because unlike many animals whose energy use is concentrated in muscles during short periods of intense action, humans carry a significant portion of their energy demand in organs that remain active across long stretches of time, especially the brain, which continues to consume energy even when the body is still, maintaining patterns of activity that support perception, memory, and the anticipation of future actions. And this constant background demand creates a situation where the body is rarely in a state of low energy use, even when it appears inactive. And when we trace this pattern back to earlier stages of human existence, we find that it aligns with a way of living that required sustained awareness rather than intermittent bursts of action. As early humans moved through environments that were complex and often unpredictable, where survival depended not only on reacting to immediate threats, but on interpreting subtle cues, remembering locations, and adjusting behavior over extended periods of time. And this kind of engagement required a steady flow of energy to systems that do not simply switch off. And over time, this shaped a body that is not only capable of extended activity, but also continuously investing energy in maintaining its readiness to act. And this investment does not disappear when movement stops, because the processes that support coordination, balance, and internal regulation continue to operate, ensuring that the body remains stable and responsive. And this is where a key difference begins to emerge when comparing humans to other animals, because many species have evolved strategies that allow them to reduce energy use more dramatically during periods of inactivity, entering states where both physical and cognitive demands are minimized, whereas humans tend to remain in a narrower range of energy use, where even rest involves ongoing internal work. And this narrow range means that the difference between activity and rest is less about turning processes on or off, and more about shifting their intensity. And as a result, the body must return to these lower intensity states more frequently in order to prevent the accumulation of small imbalances that arise from continuous operation. And if we look again at early human conditions, this pattern becomes more visible as long periods of movement across varied terrain would have required not only physical effort, but constant adjustments in posture, coordination, and attention, all of which contribute to a steady expenditure of energy that does not resolve immediately when the body pauses, and instead continues to influence internal balance, creating a need for periods where the overall demand is reduced enough to allow for recovery. And this recovery is not only about restoring energy stores, but about re-establishing coordination between systems that have been gradually shifting during activity. And this is why rest can feel necessary even when the body does not appear to be exhausted in the traditional sense, because the signals that guide rest are linked not only to how much energy has been used, but to how evenly that energy has been distributed across the body's many functions. And when this distribution becomes uneven, even slightly, the system begins to move toward a state where efficiency declines, and rest becomes the mechanism through which balance is restored. And so when we consider why humans seem to need rest more often than other animals, we begin to see that it is not simply a matter of using more energy, but of using it in a way that is continuous, distributed, and closely tied to processes that cannot be easily paused, reflecting a pattern that emerged over long periods of human evolution and continues to shape the experience of the body in the present. When energy use is spread across many systems at once, the body does not experience fatigue as a single event, but as a gradual change in how efficiently those systems work together. And this gradual change becomes especially noticeable in humans because of the way different parts of the body depend on one another in real time, where a slight decline in one area can influence several others, and this interconnected structure means that energy is not only consumed, but constantly redistributed, moving between muscles, organs, and the brain in response to shifting demands. And unlike animals that rely on short, clearly defined bursts of effort followed by extended periods of low activity, humans often operate within a narrower range where energy use rarely drops to minimal levels, and this creates a continuous baseline of demand that must be managed carefully over time. And if we look again toward the environments in which early humans lived, this pattern becomes easier to see, as daily life involved long stretches of movement across uneven ground, with each step requiring small adjustments in balance, each change in light requiring shifts in perception, and each sound or sign requiring attention. And even when the body paused, these adjustments did not fully stop, because the systems responsible for maintaining posture, processing sensory input, and anticipating the next movement continued to operate. And this meant that energy was not simply spent and then restored, but circulated through a network of processes that rarely disengaged completely. And over time, this circulation introduced small imbalances, where certain systems would begin to lag slightly behind others, not enough to cause immediate failure, but enough to reduce overall efficiency. And this reduction might appear as a slight delay in reaction, a less precise movement, or a momentary lapse in attention. And while these changes are subtle, in early human environments they could have meaningful consequences, making the ability to recognize and respond to them an important part of survival. And this is where the need for rest becomes more clearly defined, not as a response to complete exhaustion, but as a response to the early signs of imbalance within the system. And rest allows the body to redistribute energy more evenly, to bring slower systems back into alignment with faster ones. and to reduce the background level of demand so that internal processes can stabilize. And when compared to other animals, the difference lies in how tightly their energy use is linked to specific behaviors, because many species can enter states where both movement and internal processing are reduced to a minimum, conserving energy in a way that is more distinct and clearly separated from periods of activity, whereas humans remain partially engaged even in states of rest, maintaining a level of internal coordination that continues to require energy, and this partial engagement means that recovery cannot be delayed indefinitely, because the system never fully shuts down, and therefore continues to accumulate small discrepancies over time. And if we return once more to the early stages of human existence, we can imagine that rest would have been taken not only after visible effort, but also in response to these quieter signals, perhaps during moments when movement slowed, when attention softened, or when the environment allowed for a temporary reduction in demand. And these moments would have served not only to restore energy, but to maintain the coherence of the system as a whole, ensuring that perception, movement, and decision-making remained aligned. And this alignment is what allows the body to function smoothly across extended periods. And without it, even a well-supplied body would begin to show signs of strain. And so the frequent need for rest in humans can be understood as a reflection of how energy flows through a complex and continuously active system, where maintaining balance is as important as maintaining supply, and where rest serves as the mechanism through which that balance is preserved over time. When the flow of energy within the human body is continuous and widely distributed, the limits of that system are not defined by a single point of exhaustion, but by how well its many parts remain synchronized over time. And this synchronization depends on the ability of different systems to respond at similar speeds and with similar precision, because even a small delay in one process can create a mismatch that affects the whole, and this becomes especially important in humans, where movement, perception, and decision-making are closely linked and must operate together across extended periods. And if one part begins to lag, the others must compensate, drawing on additional energy and gradually increasing the overall strain on the system. And this compensation can continue for a time without obvious signs, but it cannot be sustained indefinitely, because each adjustment introduces new demands, and over time these demands accumulate in ways that are subtle but persistent, leading to a gradual decline in efficiency that is often felt before it is clearly seen. And this is where rest begins to appear, not as a response to depletion, but as a response to desynchronization, allowing the body to restore alignment between processes that have drifted apart. And if we look back toward the early human environment, this need for synchronization would have been shaped by conditions that required precise coordination, such as moving across uneven terrain, using tools, or interpreting complex sensory information, where timing and accuracy were as important as strength or speed. And in these situations, even a small mismatch between perception and action could increase risk, making the ability to maintain alignment a key aspect of survival, and rest provided the opportunity for this alignment to be re-established, reducing the background level of activity so that systems could adjust without the added pressure of ongoing demand. And this adjustment is not limited to physical coordination but extends to internal regulation, including the balance of temperature, fluid levels, and metabolic processes, all of which must remain within certain ranges for the body to function effectively. And when these processes begin to drift, even slightly, the body signals the need for reduced activity, not because it has reached a hard limit, but because it is approaching a state where further activity would increase instability. And this form of signaling is often quiet, appearing as a sense of slowing, a decrease in clarity, or a subtle resistance to continued effort. And these signals can be easy to overlook, especially in environments that encourage continuous activity, but they reflect a deeper pattern within the human system, one that prioritizes long-term stability over short-term performance. And when we compare this to other animals, the difference becomes clearer, because many species operate within more defined cycles of action and rest, where synchronization is achieved through periods of near-complete disengagement, allowing systems to reset more fully before the next phase of activity, whereas humans tend to maintain partial engagement even during rest, preserving a level of coordination that supports complex behavior but also limits the extent to which the system can fully disengage. And this partial disengagement means that synchronization must be restored more frequently, As the system never moves far from its active state and therefore continues to accumulate small discrepancies, and if we return once more to the origins of human life, we can see how this pattern would have supported a mode of existence that relied on sustained awareness and adaptability, where the ability to remain engaged across long periods was balanced by the need to regularly reduce demand and restore alignment, and this balance remains present in the human body today, shaping the experience of rest as something that arises not only after effort, but alongside it, woven into the continuous flow of activity that defines human life. And so the need for rest, when viewed through this lens, reflects not a simple deficit of energy, but a deeper requirement to maintain coherence within a system that is always in motion, even when it appears still. If the need for rest in the human body is shaped not only by energy use, but by the constant effort to keep many systems aligned, then the role of the brain becomes central to understanding why this need appears so frequently, because unlike most organs that can reduce their activity when the body is still, the brain maintains a continuous level of operation that does not fully pause, even during sleep, and this persistent activity reflects the role it plays in coordinating perception, movement, memory, and internal regulation, all of which must remain responsive to changing conditions. And when we look closely at how the brain functions, we find that it is not simply reacting to the present moment, but continuously comparing incoming information with stored patterns, predicting what might happen next, and adjusting the body's responses accordingly. And this process requires a steady flow of energy and a stable internal environment, making the brain one of the most demanding systems in the body, not because it produces visible movement, but because it sustains a constant background of activity that supports everything else. And this pattern can be traced back to early human conditions, where survival depended not only on physical strength, but on the ability to interpret subtle cues in the environment, such as changes in light, shifts in sound, or traces left by other living beings, and this required the brain to remain engaged even in moments when the body was not actively moving, maintaining a readiness that allowed for quick adaptation when needed. And over time, this created a system in which the brain rarely enters a state of true inactivity, instead shifting between different modes of operation, each with its own pattern of energy use and coordination. And this is where the concept of rest becomes more complex, because rest is not a period when the brain stops working, but a period when it reorganizes its activity, redistributing resources, strengthening certain connections, and reducing the noise that accumulates during continuous engagement. And this reorganization is essential for maintaining clarity and precision, because without it, the patterns that guide perception and action would become less distinct, leading to slower responses and less accurate decisions. And if we consider how this would have affected early humans, the consequences of such changes could have been significant, as even a slight delay in recognizing a signal or interpreting a situation could influence the outcome of an encounter with the environment. And this makes the need for rest not only a matter of comfort, but a condition for maintaining the effectiveness of the system as a whole. And when we compare this to other animals, the difference is not that their brains are inactive, but that their patterns of activity may be more closely tied to specific behaviors, allowing for clearer transitions between states of engagement and disengagement, whereas the human brain tends to remain active across a wider range of conditions, supporting a level of flexibility and adaptability that comes with an increased need for regular reorganization. And this is why rest can feel necessary even when the body does not show clear signs of fatigue, because the signals that guide rest often originate from the brain's need to recalibrate its internal patterns, rather than from the depletion of physical energy alone. And these signals may appear as a reduced ability to focus, a tendency toward distraction, or a subtle sense that effort is becoming less effective, all of which indicate that the system is moving away from its optimal state and requires a period of reduced demand to restore balance. And when viewed in this way, the human need for rest begins to reflect the nature of a brain that never fully stops, continuously shaping and reshaping its activity in response to both the past and the present, and requiring regular intervals of adjustment in order to maintain the coherence that allows the body to function across time. Even when the body appears still and the eyes are closed, the brain does not withdraw from its activity but shifts into patterns that are quieter on the surface yet deeply structured beneath. And this shift reveals that rest is not defined by silence within the system, but by a change in how information is organized and processed. Because during periods of reduced external demand, the brain begins to revisit patterns formed during waking activity, adjusting connections between regions, refining responses, and reducing the accumulation of signals that are no longer useful. And this process is not something that can be postponed indefinitely, because the longer the brain remains in a state of continuous engagement without reorganization, the more its internal patterns begin to overlap and interfere with one another, leading to a gradual loss of clarity that can affect perception, decision-making, and coordination. And this is where the human need for rest becomes closely tied to the nature of memory itself. Not as a collection of stored images, but as a dynamic system that must be continuously maintained, because each experience leaves traces that influence how future information is interpreted. And without periods of adjustment, these traces would accumulate without distinction, making it more difficult for the brain to differentiate between what is relevant and what is not. And if we look back to the early stages of human existence, this function would have been essential, as survival depended on the ability to recognize patterns in the environment, remember locations, and anticipate changes over time, all of which required not only the formation of memory, but its ongoing refinement. And this refinement could not occur effectively while the brain was fully engaged with external demands, because the same systems used for processing incoming information are also needed to reorganize internal patterns. And this creates a natural tension between engagement and reorganization, where the brain must regularly shift away from one in order to support the other. And this shift is what we experience as rest, not as a complete disengagement, but as a redirection of activity inward, allowing the system to restore the distinctions that support clear perception and effective action. And this process also helps to stabilize emotional responses, as patterns associated with past experiences are integrated into a broader context, reducing the likelihood that immediate reactions will dominate behavior in ways that are no longer appropriate to the current environment. And when this reorganization is delayed, the effects are often subtle at first, appearing as a reduced ability to focus, an increase in distraction, or a sense that effort requires more concentration than before. But over time, these effects can accumulate, making it more difficult to maintain the coherence that allows the brain to function smoothly. And when we compare this to other animals, the difference is not that they do not reorganize their internal patterns, but that the complexity and variability of human experience place greater demands on this process, as the range of information that must be integrated is broader and less predictable, requiring more frequent opportunities for adjustment. And this is why rest in humans often appears not only after physical effort, but also after periods of sustained mental activity, even when the body has not been visibly active, because the brain has been engaged in processes that require their own form of recovery. And if we return again to the conditions of early human life, we can imagine that moments of reduced activity, whether during the fading of light or in quieter periods between movement, would have provided the space for this internal reorganization to occur, supporting the continuity of perception and action across days and seasons. And this continuity, maintained through cycles of engagement and rest, reflects a system that is not designed to operate without pause, but to move through a rhythm where each phase supports the next, and where rest is not a break from activity but an essential part of the process that allows the brain to remain effective over time. When the brain is continuously active and must regularly reorganize its internal patterns, the boundary between effort and rest becomes less defined, and this creates a condition in which the need for rest can arise even while the body appears capable of continuing, because what is being preserved is not only energy, but the structure of thought and perception itself. And this preservation depends on maintaining clear distinctions between signals, allowing the brain to recognize patterns accurately and respond with precision. And over time, as experiences accumulate, these distinctions become more difficult to maintain without deliberate periods of reduced demand, because each new piece of information interacts with what is already present, creating layers of activity that must be sorted and integrated. And if this integration is delayed, the system begins to show signs of overlap, where signals interfere with one another, reducing clarity and increasing the effort required to interpret the environment. And this is often felt as a kind of mental heaviness, not sharp enough to be identified as a specific problem, but present enough to alter the quality of attention and decision-making. And this form of fatigue is different from the immediate exhaustion that follows intense physical effort, because it builds gradually and can persist even when the body is still, reflecting the ongoing work of the brain rather than the depletion of muscular energy. And if we consider how this would have influenced early humans, the ability to maintain clear perception over long periods would have been essential, as subtle changes in the environment could signal opportunities or risks, and the cost of misinterpretation could be significant, making the maintenance of clarity a critical aspect of survival. And this maintenance required not only the accumulation of experience but the ability to reorganize it, to separate what was useful from what was not, and to preserve patterns that supported effective action. And this process could not occur effectively in the midst of continuous engagement, because the same systems that process incoming information are also responsible for refining internal patterns, and this overlap creates a need for intervals where external demand is reduced, allowing the brain to shift its focus inward and restore coherence. And this restoration does not produce an immediate change but gradually improves the alignment between perception and response, reducing the effort required to act and increasing the reliability of decisions. And when this process is interrupted or insufficient, the effects may appear as a growing sense of strain, where even simple tasks require more attention, and where the ability to sustain focus becomes more difficult. And these changes can occur without any clear sign of physical fatigue, highlighting the extent to which the brain contributes to the overall need for rest. And when comparing this to other animals, the difference lies in the degree to which behavior depends on flexible and context-dependent processing, because species with more specialized patterns of behavior may rely on more stable and repetitive responses, reducing the need for continuous reorganization, whereas humans operate within a wider range of possibilities, requiring the brain to remain adaptable and responsive to new conditions. And this adaptability comes with the cost of needing more frequent opportunities to reorganize internal patterns. And if we return once more to the early human environment, we can imagine that the rhythm of activity and rest would have supported this need, providing periods where attention could soften and internal processes could proceed without interference. And this rhythm, though less visible in modern conditions, remains embedded within the structure of the brain, shaping the experience of rest as something that arises not only after visible effort, but as a quiet requirement of a system that is always in the process of refining itself. And so the human need for rest, when viewed through the lens of the brain, reflects not a limitation but a consequence of a system that is designed to learn, adapt, and remain responsive across time, requiring regular intervals of reduced demand to maintain the clarity that makes such adaptability possible. The way humans move through the world does not follow a single continuous pattern of effort, but instead unfolds in cycles, where periods of activity are naturally followed by moments of slowing, and this rhythm reflects a deeper structure within the body that favors variation over constancy, because maintaining the same level of effort without interruption would gradually reduce efficiency, even if energy reserves were still available. And this tendency toward cycles can be traced back to early human environments, where movement was rarely uniform or predictable, as individuals walked across uneven landscapes, paused to observe, adjusted their direction, and resumed movement in response to subtle changes in terrain and conditions. And these shifts were not random but formed a pattern of engagement and withdrawal that allowed the body to manage its resources over extended periods. And unlike many animals that rely on short bursts of speed or clearly defined phases of activity and rest, humans often operated within a more fluid sequence, where the intensity of effort changed gradually rather than abruptly. And this gradual change required the body to remain sensitive to its own state, detecting when small adjustments were needed to prevent the accumulation of strain. And this sensitivity is still present today, even though the environments have changed, because the underlying mechanisms that support it were shaped over long periods of evolution. And when we consider how this pattern differs from that of other animals, the contrast becomes clearer, as species that depend on rapid bursts of action often conserve energy by remaining relatively inactive between those bursts, creating a more distinct separation between effort and rest. Whereas humans, whose survival depended on sustained movement and continuous awareness, developed a system that distributes effort across time, reducing the need for sudden transitions but increasing the importance of regular adjustments. And these adjustments often take the form of brief pauses, changes in posture, or shifts in attention, which may seem minor, but play a significant role in maintaining the overall balance of the system. And if we return again to early human life, we can imagine long stretches of walking interspersed with moments of stillness, where attention moved from the external environment to the internal state, allowing the body to recalibrate without fully disengaging. And this pattern would have supported both endurance and adaptability, enabling individuals to continue moving without reaching a point of sudden exhaustion. And over time, this created a mode of activity that is less about pushing to a limit and more about maintaining a sustainable rhythm where effort and rest are intertwined rather than separate. And this intertwining is one of the reasons why rest appears more frequently in human life, because it is not reserved for moments of complete fatigue, but is integrated into the ongoing flow of activity, serving as a mechanism for preserving efficiency and preventing imbalance. And when viewed from this perspective, the human need for rest begins to reflect a system that is designed to operate within cycles rather than extremes, where the goal is not to maximize output in a single moment but to maintain continuity across many moments. And this continuity depends on the ability to move between states of engagement and reduce demand in a way that supports both immediate action and long-term stability. And so the pattern of cycles that defines human movement provides another layer of understanding for why rest is not an occasional necessity, but a recurring feature of how the body functions, rooted in the conditions under which humans first learned to move through the world. Within these cycles of movement and pause, the human body does not simply alternate between effort and recovery in a predictable sequence, but adjusts continuously to small changes in both the environment and its own internal state. And this ongoing adjustment reveals that rest is often woven into activity itself, appearing not only as complete stillness, but as subtle reductions in intensity that allow the system to maintain stability over time. And this becomes clearer when considering how early humans moved through landscapes that offered no fixed paths or uniform surfaces, where each step required a response to uneven ground, variations in texture, and shifts in elevation. And these conditions meant that movement was never entirely automatic, but always involved a degree of attention and correction. And as these corrections accumulated, the body would naturally shift toward moments of reduced demand, not as a conscious decision, but as a response to the gradual build of strain across multiple systems. And these moments might have been brief, such as slowing the pace, changing posture, or allowing attention to soften, but they played an important role in preventing the drift that occurs when systems operate continuously without adjustment. And this drift is not immediately visible, yet it affects the coordination between muscles, the accuracy of perception, and the timing of responses, all of which are essential for maintaining effective movement across extended periods. And when compared to animals that rely on more repetitive or specialized patterns of motion, the difference becomes apparent, because such species can often sustain their activity with fewer adjustments, allowing for clearer separation between periods of action and rest, whereas humans, whose movements are more varied and context-dependent, must constantly recalibrate. And this recalibration requires opportunities for reduced demand that may not resemble rest in the traditional sense, but serve a similar function. And if we look again to the conditions of early human life, these opportunities would have emerged naturally as the environment itself imposed variations in pace and intensity, creating a rhythm that alternated between engagement and relative ease. And within this rhythm, rest was not a distinct event but a gradual shift, integrated into the flow of movement and shaped by external conditions. And this integration allowed the body to maintain a balance between effort and recovery without reaching extremes, supporting a form of endurance that depended less on pushing beyond limits and more on avoiding the accumulation of imbalance. And over time, this pattern became embedded within the structure of the human system, influencing how energy is managed and how fatigue is experienced. And this is why rest can often take the form of small adjustments rather than complete tawakkuf, appearing as a natural part of ongoing activity rather than a separate phase that follows it. And in modern contexts, where movement is often more constrained and environments more uniform, these subtle forms of rest may become less visible, yet the underlying need remains, because the mechanisms that drive it are rooted in a long history of adaptation to variable conditions. And when this need is not met, the body may still continue to function, but with increasing effort and decreasing efficiency, as the small discrepancies that would have been corrected through subtle shifts begin to accumulate. And so the cycles of movement and pause that characterize human activity are not simply patterns of behavior, but expressions of a deeper requirement to maintain alignment within a system that is always adjusting, always responding, and always moving toward a state of balance that can only be sustained through regular, often quiet, forms of rest. When these subtle reductions in intensity become part of the way the body moves, the distinction between working and resting begins to soften, and what emerges instead is a continuous modulation of effort, where the body is never entirely at one extreme or the other, and this modulation allows humans to extend activity across long periods without reaching a sudden point of collapse. But it also creates a condition in which rest must occur more frequently because the system does not rely on a single moment of recovery, but on many small adjustments that maintain stability over time. And this pattern can be understood more clearly by returning once again to early human environments, where movement was shaped not only by the need to reach a destination, but by the need to respond to changing conditions along the way, such as variations in terrain, shifts in weather, and the presence of other living beings. And in these conditions, maintaining a fixed level of effort would have been inefficient, as it would not allow for the flexibility required to adapt to each new situation, and so the body developed a tendency to adjust continuously, increasing or decreasing intensity as needed, and within this process, moments of reduced demand served as opportunities to restore alignment between systems that had begun to drift during periods of greater effort. And these moments did not require complete stillness, but often took the form of slower movement, altered posture, or a temporary shift in attention, all of which allowed the body to recalibrate without fully disengaging from its surroundings. And this ability to remain partially engaged while reducing demand is one of the defining features of human activity, and it contributes to the sense that rest is not a separate phase but an integral part of the flow of movement itself. And when we compare this to other animals, the difference lies in how clearly their patterns of activity and rest are separated, because many species rely on cycles that involve distinct periods of intense action, followed by more complete disengagement, allowing for a clearer reset of their systems, whereas humans maintain a more continuous level of engagement, which supports adaptability but requires more frequent opportunities for partial recovery. And this continuous engagement means that the body is always balancing between maintaining readiness and preventing overload, and rest becomes the mechanism through which this balance is preserved, appearing not only after effort but within it. And if we consider how this would have supported early human survival, it becomes clear that such a pattern would allow individuals to remain responsive to their environment, while avoiding the risks associated with sudden exhaustion, as the system would rarely be pushed to its absolute limits, and instead would operate within a range that could be sustained over time. And this range, maintained through ongoing adjustments, reflects a strategy that prioritizes continuity and flexibility, and it is this strategy that underlies the human need for frequent rest, because a system that avoids extremes must rely on regular recalibration to maintain its position within that range. And in modern environments, where activity is often less varied and more sustained in a single form, this pattern can become less visible, yet the underlying requirement remains. And when the opportunities for subtle adjustment are reduced, the need for more explicit forms of rest may become more pronounced, as the system seeks other ways to restore the balance that would once have been maintained through continuous modulation. And so the cycles of effort and pause that define human movement are not simply habits but reflections of a deeper structure, one that shapes how energy is used, how fatigue develops, and how rest emerges as a recurring and necessary feature of human life, rooted in a long history of adaptation to environments that required both persistence and flexibility, and carried forward into the present as a quiet but persistent rhythm within the body. Beyond the cycles of movement and adjustment, another layer begins to shape the human need for rest, one that is less visible but constantly present, and that is the way the body manages heat. Because every form of activity, whether physical or mental, produces internal warmth that must be carefully regulated to maintain stability, and unlike many animals that rely on external conditions or specialized behaviors to control their temperature, humans developed a system that allows for extended activity across a wide range of environments, and this system depends heavily on the ability to release heat through the skin, particularly through the process of sweating, which enables the body to continue functioning even under sustained effort. Yet this ability comes with its own demands, because the loss of heat is closely tied to the loss of fluid, and maintaining the balance between temperature and hydration becomes a continuous task, one that cannot be postponed without consequences. And if we look back toward early human environments, this relationship between heat and rest becomes more apparent, as individuals often move through open landscapes where exposure to sunlight and changing weather conditions created constant variations in temperature. And in these conditions, the body would gradually accumulate heat during periods of movement, even if the effort itself was not intense, and without opportunities to reduce activity and allow for cooling, this accumulation would begin to affect internal processes, not immediately as a dramatic failure, but as a subtle shift in efficiency, where coordination becomes less precise and perception slightly less clear. And these changes would have signaled the need to slow down, to seek shade, or to pause, allowing the body to release excess heat and restore balance. And this form of rest is different from rest driven by muscular fatigue or cognitive demand, because it is linked directly to the physical limits of temperature regulation, and it operates continuously, influencing how long activity can be sustained before adjustment becomes necessary. And when we compare this to other animals, the difference becomes clearer, because many species are adapted to specific thermal environments, with behaviors or physiological traits that allow them to avoid overheating, or to tolerate higher temperatures without the same level of fluid loss, whereas humans rely on a system that supports flexibility across environments but requires more frequent management of internal conditions. And this management often takes the form of rest, not as a separate event, but as a reduction in activity that allows heat to dissipate and fluid balance to be maintained. And if this process is delayed, the body does not immediately stop, but begins to operate under increasing strain, as the mechanisms that support coordination and perception become less effective in conditions of rising temperature. And this gradual change would have been especially important in early human contexts, where access to water and shelter was not always immediate, making the timing of rest a critical factor in maintaining stability. And this pattern remains present in modern humans, even though the environments have changed, because the underlying mechanisms of heat regulation have not been replaced. And so the need for rest continues to be influenced not only by energy use and neural activity, but also by the ongoing requirement to manage temperature and hydration. And this adds another dimension to the question of why humans seem to need rest more often than other animals, suggesting that the answer lies not in a single cause, but in the interaction of multiple systems, each contributing to a pattern where continuous activity must be balanced by regular intervals of reduced demand in order to preserve the conditions that allow the body to function effectively over time. As the body continues to regulate its temperature through the release of heat, the balance between cooling and maintaining internal stability becomes increasingly delicate, because the same process that allows heat to escape also draws on the body's reserves of fluid, and this creates a situation in which the ability to remain active is tied not only to energy, but to the availability and distribution of water within the system. And unlike energy stores that can be accumulated and used over longer periods, fluid balance requires more immediate attention, as even small shifts can influence circulation, temperature control, and the efficiency of muscles and the brain. And this sensitivity becomes especially important when considering how early humans moved through environments where access to water was not constant, and where the timing of movement and rest had to be adjusted in response to both temperature and resource availability. And in such conditions, rest would have served not only as a means of reducing effort, but as a way to slow the loss of fluid, allowing the body to stabilize before continuing. And this pattern would have shaped behavior in subtle ways, encouraging periods of reduced activity during the warmest parts of the day or after extended movement, even when there was no immediate sign of exhaustion, because the signals that guided rest were linked to the maintenance of internal balance rather than to a single point of fatigue. And this can be understood by considering how the body responds to rising temperature, where the increase in heat prompts the release of fluid through the skin. And as this process continues, the volume of circulating fluid begins to shift, affecting the delivery of oxygen and nutrients to tissues. And while these changes may be gradual, they influence the coordination between systems, making it more difficult to sustain precise movement and clear perception. And this is where rest becomes necessary, not because the body has reached a limit in terms of strength or endurance, but because the conditions that support stable function are beginning to drift. And when compared to other animals, the difference lies in how their systems manage heat and fluid, as many species rely on behaviors such as seeking shade, reducing activity during certain times, or using specialized anatomical features to regulate temperature with less dependence on continuous fluid loss, whereas humans, with their capacity for sustained activity in open environments, depend more heavily on sweating, and this dependence increases the frequency with which rest must occur, as the system cannot maintain balance indefinitely under conditions of ongoing heat production and fluid loss. And if we return again to early human life, we can imagine that movement across sunlit terrain would have been interspersed with pauses in shaded areas, or with slower, more measured activity that allowed heat to dissipate and fluid loss to stabilize. And these pauses would have been an integral part of the overall pattern of movement, not interruptions but necessary adjustments that preserve the ability to continue, and this pattern remains present today, even if it is less consciously recognized, because the mechanisms that drive it are still active within the body, influencing how long effort can be sustained and when the need for rest begins to appear. And this adds another layer to the understanding of why humans require rest more frequently than many other animals, showing that the need is shaped not only by energy and neural activity, but also by the continuous management of temperature and hydration, which together create a system that must regularly reduce its level of demand in order to maintain the conditions necessary for continued function. As heat continues to build and fluid is gradually lost through the skin, the body is not only managing temperature, but also adjusting how its systems communicate and cooperate, because the movement of fluid through the body supports the transport of signals, nutrients, and heat itself. And when this movement becomes less stable, even slightly, the coordination between different parts of the system begins to shift. And this shift does not immediately stop activity, but changes its quality, making movements feel heavier, slowing the timing of responses, and altering the clarity of perception in ways that are often subtle but persistent. And this is where the need for rest becomes closely tied to the preservation of internal conditions, rather than the restoration of depleted energy. Because what the body is maintaining is not simply fuel, but the medium through which all processes interact. And if we look again toward early human environments, this relationship would have been constantly present, as individuals moved through spaces where exposure to sunlight, variations in terrain, and the availability of water all influenced how heat and fluid were managed. And in these conditions, rest would have served as a way to interrupt the gradual drift that occurs when fluid balance is challenged, allowing the body to slow the loss of water, redistribute what remained, and restore the conditions necessary for coordinated function. And these pauses would not have required complete inactivity, but often took the form of reduced movement, changes in posture, or shifts in location, such as moving into shade or adjusting the timing of travel. And through these adjustments, the body could maintain its capacity to continue without reaching a point where instability became more difficult to reverse. And when compared to other animals, the difference becomes clearer, because many species have evolved strategies that either limit exposure to heat or reduce the reliance on continuous fluid loss, allowing them to sustain activity within a narrower range of conditions, whereas humans, with their ability to move across varied environments and remain active for extended periods, depend on a system that trades efficiency for flexibility. And this trade requires more frequent opportunities to restore balance, as the conditions that support stable function are more easily disturbed by ongoing activity. And if we consider how this pattern persists in modern life, it becomes evident that the need for rest is still influenced by the same underlying mechanisms, even when environmental conditions appear more controlled, because the body continues to produce heat and manage fluid in the same fundamental way. And when opportunities for subtle adjustment are limited, the signals that guide rest may become more pronounced, appearing as a sense of fatigue that does not correspond directly to visible effort, but reflects the internal state of the system. And this highlights the extent to which the human need for rest is shaped by processes that operate continuously beneath the surface, linking movement, temperature, and fluid balance into a single dynamic system. And within this system, rest emerges as a recurring response to the gradual changes that occur during activity, allowing the body to maintain the conditions necessary for continued function across time. And so the role of heat and hydration adds another dimension to the understanding of why humans require rest more frequently than many other animals, showing that the need arises not from a single limitation but from the interaction of multiple processes, each contributing to a pattern where sustained activity must be balanced by regular intervals of reduced demand in order to preserve stability and coherence within the body. Beneath the surface of movement, another quiet factor shapes how and when the human body must rest. And this factor lies in the structure of the muscles themselves, because not all muscle is designed for the same purpose. And in humans, the balance between strength and endurance reflects a particular evolutionary direction, one that favors the ability to sustain activity over time, rather than to produce short bursts of force. And this can be understood by considering how different types of muscle fibers function, where some are adapted for rapid, powerful contractions that cannot be maintained for long, while others are suited for slower, more sustained activity that can continue over extended periods. And in humans, there is a tendency toward the latter, supporting movements such as walking, carrying, and maintaining posture, all of which require consistency rather than intensity. And when we trace this pattern back to early human life, it aligns with a mode of survival that depended on covering distance, tracking movement, and remaining active across large areas rather than relying on brief moments of extreme force. And this does not mean that humans lack the ability to produce strength, but that the system as a whole is organized to prioritize continuity, and this organization influences how fatigue develops, because muscles that are used for sustained activity do not fail suddenly, but gradually lose efficiency, as small imbalances accumulate within their fibers, affecting the way they contract, relax, and coordinate with one another. And this gradual change is often less visible than the immediate exhaustion that follows intense effort, but it plays a significant role in shaping the need for rest, because it creates a condition where the body continues to function but with increasing effort, as if each movement requires slightly more adjustment than before, and this adjustment draws on additional energy and introduces further strain, creating a feedback loop that cannot be maintained indefinitely without interruption. And this is where rest becomes necessary, not because the muscles have reached an absolute limit, but because the quality of their function is beginning to decline. And rest allows the processes within muscle fibers to rebalance, restoring the conditions that support smooth and coordinated movement. And when compared to other animals, the difference becomes more apparent, because species that rely on bursts of power often have muscles that are optimized for rapid action, followed by clear periods of recovery, allowing for a more distinct separation between effort and rest. Whereas humans, whose muscles are adapted for endurance, operate within a narrower range of intensity, where activity can continue for long periods but requires more frequent opportunities for adjustment. And if we return once more to the early human environment, this pattern would have been expressed in the rhythm of daily movement, where long stretches of walking were interspersed with moments of reduced demand, allowing muscles to recover without fully disengaging, and these moments would have supported the maintenance of coordination and balance, ensuring that the body could continue to move effectively across changing terrain. And this pattern remains present in modern humans, even when the forms of movement have changed, because the underlying structure of the muscles has not been replaced, and so the need for rest continues to reflect not only the amount of effort exerted, but the way that effort is distributed across time. And this distribution, shaped by the evolutionary shift toward endurance, contributes to a pattern where rest is required more frequently, not as a response to sudden failure, but as a means of preserving the quality of movement across extended periods. And in this way, the structure of human muscle adds another layer to the understanding of why rest is such a persistent feature of human life, showing that it is not only the demands of the brain or the management of energy and heat that create this need, but also the way the body is built to move, slowly, steadily, and in a manner that depends on regular intervals of recovery to maintain its effectiveness over time. When muscles are adapted for endurance rather than brief force, the way they experience strain becomes more diffuse and less immediately visible, because instead of reaching a point where contraction simply cannot continue, they begin to change gradually in how efficiently they generate and control movement, and this change is influenced by the internal processes within muscle fibers, where repeated contractions alter the balance of chemical signals, the availability of resources, and the coordination between neighboring fibers. And as these shifts accumulate, the muscle does not stop working but requires more effort to produce the same result. And this increased effort draws on additional energy while also placing greater demand on the systems that support coordination and stability, creating a subtle feedback loop in which each movement contributes to a small increase in strain that is not fully resolved during continued activity. And if we return to the conditions of early human life, this pattern would have been present during long periods of walking, carrying, or maintaining posture, where the body was rarely pushed to its absolute limits but was continuously engaged in moderate effort. And in such conditions, the signals that indicate the need for rest would not appear as sudden weakness, but as a gradual shift in the quality of movement, perhaps felt as a slight heaviness in the limbs, a reduction in precision, or a tendency for movements to become less coordinated over time. And these signals would have guided behavior toward moments of reduced demand, allowing the internal state of the muscles to stabilize before continuing, and this form of rest would have been integrated into the flow of activity, appearing as slower movement, brief pauses, or changes in posture that redistributed the load across different parts of the body. And these adjustments would have helped to prevent the accumulation of strain from reaching a level where it could disrupt movement more significantly. And when compared to other animals, the difference becomes clearer, because species that rely on rapid, powerful movements often experience fatigue in a more concentrated way, where the limitation is reached quickly and followed by a period of more complete recovery. Whereas humans, whose muscles are designed to operate within a sustained range, experience fatigue as a continuous process, where the boundary between effort and recovery is less distinct. And this continuous process requires more frequent opportunities for partial recovery, as the system cannot rely on a single period of rest to restore balance after prolonged activity, and instead depends on many smaller intervals that allow for ongoing adjustment. And if we consider how this pattern persists in modern contexts, it becomes evident that the need for rest remains closely tied to the way muscles function, even when the forms of movement have changed, because the underlying mechanisms that govern contraction, coordination, and recovery are still the same. And when activity continues without sufficient opportunities for adjustment, the body may still be able to perform tasks, but with increasing effort and decreasing efficiency, as the internal balance of the muscles becomes more difficult to maintain. And this highlights the extent to which rest is not only a response to visible exertion, but a necessary component of how muscles sustain activity over time, allowing them to continue operating within a range that supports both movement and stability. And so the endurance-oriented structure of human muscle contributes to a pattern where rest is required more often, not because the body is less capable, but because it is designed to function continuously, relying on regular moments of reduced demand to preserve the conditions that make that continuity possible. As this gradual form of muscular strain continues to build, the body does not wait for a complete breakdown before signaling the need for adjustment, but instead begins to redistribute effort across different groups of muscles, subtly changing posture, movement patterns, and the timing of contractions in order to reduce the load on any one area. And this redistribution is not always conscious, but can be observed in the way movements become less direct, slightly slower, or more varied over time, as if the body is searching for a configuration that allows it to continue with less strain. And while this strategy helps to extend activity, it also introduces new demands, because shifting effort from one set of muscles to another requires coordination, drawing on additional energy and increasing the complexity of the system's operation. And over time, this creates a situation where the body is not only managing the original strain, but also the consequences of its own adjustments. And this layered demand cannot be maintained indefinitely without periods of reduced activity, because each new configuration introduces its own set of imbalances that must be resolved. And this is where rest becomes essential, not as a response to a single point of failure, but as a means of allowing the system to return to a more stable baseline, where muscle fibers can recover their internal balance and coordination between groups can be restored. And if we consider how this would have functioned in early human environments, the need for such recalibration would have been constant as individuals moved across varied terrain, carried loads, and adjusted their movements in response to changing conditions. And in these contexts, rest would have taken many forms, from brief pauses to changes in pace or posture, each providing an opportunity for the body to reduce strain and restore alignment. And these moments would have been integrated into the rhythm of activity, allowing movement to continue without reaching a point of sudden failure. And when compared to other animals, the difference becomes more apparent, because species that rely on specialized forms of movement often have more fixed patterns of muscle use, allowing them to sustain activity within a narrow range without frequent redistribution, whereas humans, whose movements are more varied and adaptable, rely on continuous adjustment, and this reliance increases the need for regular intervals of rest, as the system must frequently reorganize itself to maintain efficiency. And if we return once more to the broader pattern of human evolution, this adaptability in movement would have provided a significant advantage, enabling individuals to navigate complex environments and perform a wide range of tasks. But it also came with the cost of requiring more frequent recalibration, as the flexibility of the system introduces additional points of potential imbalance. And this cost is reflected in the persistent need for rest, which appears not only after visible effort but throughout the process of movement itself. And in modern contexts, where movement may be more repetitive or constrained, this need can manifest in different ways, sometimes appearing as discomfort or reduced efficiency even in the absence of intense activity, highlighting the extent to which the body depends on variation and adjustment to maintain its function. And so the structure and behavior of human muscle contribute to a pattern where rest is woven into the fabric of activity, serving as a necessary mechanism for preserving coordination and stability within a system that is constantly adapting. And this pattern, shaped over long periods of human history, continues to influence how the body responds to effort, revealing that the need for rest is not a sign of limitation, but an integral part of how movement is sustained across time. Beyond the continuous adjustments of muscle and the steady demands of the brain, another slower process shapes the human need for rest, one that unfolds beneath the surface and does not always announce itself clearly. And this process is the gradual wear that occurs in tissues as they are used, because every movement, no matter how controlled, introduces small changes within muscles, joints, and connective structures. And these changes are not failures but part of normal function. Yet they require time to be resolved, as the body must repair microscopic disruptions and restore the integrity of the structures that support movement. And unlike the rapid cycles of contraction and relaxation that define muscle activity, these processes of repair operate on a different timescale, one that cannot be accelerated simply by continuing to move, and this creates a condition in which activity and repair are always overlapping but cannot fully occur at the same moment. And this overlap becomes especially significant in humans, whose patterns of movement often extend across long periods, allowing small amounts of wear to accumulate gradually rather than appearing as sudden injury. And if we look back to early human environments, this accumulation would have been a constant presence, as individuals walked long distances, carried objects, and interacted with uneven terrain, all of which introduced repeated stress to joints and connective tissues. And over time, these stresses would not necessarily produce immediate discomfort, but would influence how smoothly movement could be maintained, subtly altering alignment and increasing the effort required for coordination. And this is where rest becomes essential, not only to restore energy or reorganize neural patterns, but to allow the slower processes of repair to proceed without additional strain, because continued activity, even at moderate levels, can delay the resolution of these small disruptions, extending their effects and increasing the likelihood that they will influence overall function. And this does not mean that the body is fragile, but that it operates within a balance where use and repair must remain coordinated, and when this balance shifts too far toward continuous use, the signals that guide rest begin to appear, often as a diffuse sense of stiffness, reduced ease of movement, or a slight discomfort that does not correspond to a single point of injury. And these signals serve as a reminder that the system requires time not only to adjust, but to restore the physical structures that support its activity. And when compared to other animals, the difference becomes more apparent, because many species have movement patterns that are either more intermittent or more specialized, allowing for clearer periods where repair can occur with less interference, whereas humans, whose activity is often sustained and varied, must integrate repair into their ongoing rhythm of movement, requiring more frequent opportunities for reduced demand. And if we return again to the broader context of human evolution, This need for repair would have influenced how activity was distributed across time, encouraging patterns where effort was balanced with periods of lower intensity, allowing tissues to recover without interrupting the overall flow of life. And this pattern remains present in modern humans, even when the forms of movement have changed, because the underlying biology of tissue repair has not been altered. And so the need for rest continues to reflect not only the immediate demands of activity, but the slower, ongoing processes that maintain the body's structure, showing that rest is not only about stopping, but about allowing the body to renew itself at a level that is not always visible, yet essential for sustaining movement across time. As these small processes of wear and repair continue beneath the surface, the body must constantly balance the timing between using its structures and allowing them to recover. And this balance is not fixed but shifts in response to how frequently and how consistently those structures are engaged, because repeated use, even at moderate levels, can delay the completion of repair, causing small disruptions to remain unresolved for longer periods, and over time this creates a subtle accumulation that does not appear as a single injury but influences the overall quality of movement, making it less fluid, less precise, and slightly more effortful. And this change can be difficult to detect at first, as the body compensates by adjusting posture, redistributing load, and altering movement patterns. But these compensations themselves introduce new demands, creating a layered process in which the system is continuously adapting to its own internal state. And if we return again to early human environments, this dynamic would have been present in everyday activity. As individuals moved across varied terrain, carried tools or resources, and adjusted their movements in response to shifting conditions. And in these contexts, the need for rest would not have been determined solely by visible fatigue, but by the accumulation of these small, ongoing processes, guiding behavior toward moments where activity could be reduced and repair could proceed more effectively. And these moments might have taken the form of slowing down, pausing briefly, or choosing routes that required less strain, all of which would have allowed the body to maintain its structural integrity over time. And when compared to other animals, the difference becomes clearer, because many species either concentrate their activity into shorter periods or rely on more specialized forms of movement that place stress on specific structures in more predictable ways, allowing for clearer intervals where repair can occur with minimal interference, whereas humans, whose movement is both sustained and varied, distribute stress across many parts of the body, making the process of repair more diffuse and requiring more frequent opportunities for reduced demand. And this diffuse pattern means that rest is not only necessary after intense effort, but also during periods of moderate, ongoing activity, as the body seeks to prevent the accumulation of small disruptions from reaching a level where they begin to affect coordination and stability. And if this process is delayed, the effects may become more noticeable, appearing as stiffness, reduced range of motion, or a sense that movement requires more attention than before, and these signals reflect the body's attempt to maintain balance between use and repair, encouraging a shift toward conditions that allow for recovery. And this balance is essential for sustaining activity over long periods, as it ensures that the structures supporting movement remain aligned and functional. And when viewed in this way, the need for rest becomes closely tied to the maintenance of the body's physical framework, not as a reaction to failure, but as a continuous process that supports the ability to move, adapt, and respond across time. And so the accumulation of small, unresolved changes within tissues provides another perspective on why humans require rest more frequently than many other animals, showing that the need arises not only from immediate demands, but from the ongoing interaction between use and repair that defines how the body maintains itself over extended periods of activity. As the cycle of use and repair continues, the body gradually learns to signal the need for rest before visible damage appears, not as a warning of immediate failure, but as a way of preserving the conditions under which repair can remain effective. And these signals often emerge quietly, as a sense of stiffness, a reduced ease of movement, or a subtle resistance to continued effort that does not correspond to any single point of strain. And this quiet signaling reflects the fact that the processes involved in maintaining tissue integrity operate below the level of conscious awareness, adjusting continuously in response to how structures are being used, And when the balance begins to shift too far toward continuous use, the body responds not by forcing an abrupt stop, but by encouraging a gradual reduction in demand, allowing repair to proceed without further disruption. And if we look again toward early human environments, this pattern would have been closely tied to the rhythm of daily life, where movement was interspersed with periods of lower intensity, not only because of changes in external conditions, but because the body itself required time to restore the integrity of its structures, and these periods would have allowed small disruptions within muscles, joints, and connective tissues to resolve before they accumulated into more significant imbalances, supporting a form of endurance that depended on maintaining the body's framework rather than pushing it to its limits. And when compared to other animals, the difference becomes more apparent, because species that rely on more specialized or intermittent patterns of movement often experience clearer boundaries between use and repair, allowing for more distinct phases where tissues can recover with minimal interference. Whereas humans, whose activity is both sustained and varied, must integrate repair into their ongoing pattern of movement, requiring more frequent opportunities for reduced demand. And this integration means that rest is not simply a response to injury or exhaustion, but a continuous requirement for preserving structural stability. And if we consider how this pattern persists in modern contexts, it becomes evident that the same underlying mechanisms continue to shape how the body responds to activity, even when the forms of movement have changed, because the processes of tissue maintenance and repair remain the same. And when opportunities for rest are limited, the signals that guide it may become more pronounced, appearing as discomfort, reduced mobility, or a growing sense of strain that reflects the body's attempt to restore balance. And these signals highlight the importance of allowing repair to occur alongside activity, as the two processes cannot be separated without affecting the system as a whole. And so the human need for rest, when viewed through the lens of tissue repair, reveals a pattern where continuity depends not only on the ability to move, but on the ability to maintain the structures that support movement. And this maintenance requires regular intervals of reduced demand, allowing the body to renew itself at a level that is not immediately visible, but essential for sustaining function across time. And in this way, the processes of wear and repair add another dimension to the understanding of why humans require rest more frequently than many other animals, showing that the need arises from the continuous effort to preserve the integrity of a system that is always in use and always in the process of renewal. The need for rest in humans is not shaped by the body alone, but also by the way individuals exist together. Because unlike many animals that can operate independently or within loosely coordinated groups, humans develop patterns of life that are deeply social, where activity and rest are often synchronized across individuals, and this synchronization introduces a new layer to the experience of rest, one that is influenced activity not only by internal signals but by the shared rhythms of a group. And if we look back toward early human environments, we can imagine small groups moving through landscapes together, adjusting their pace not only to terrain and weather but to one another, where the timing of movement, pause, and recovery was shaped by collective conditions rather than individual preference. And in such settings, rest would have served not only to restore the body but to maintain cohesion within the group, allowing individuals to remain aligned in their activity and to support one another in maintaining stability. And this collective aspect of rest would have influenced how often and how long individuals paused, as the needs of the group created a rhythm that extended beyond the internal state of any single person. And this rhythm was likely tied to environmental cues such as the cycle of light and darkness, as well as to the distribution of resources and the need to maintain safety, creating periods where activity naturally slowed and opportunities for rest emerged. And within these periods, the body could recover not only because it required rest, but because the conditions of the group made rest possible. And this interplay between individual needs and social structure adds another dimension to the question of why humans require rest more frequently than many other animals, because it suggests that rest is not only a biological necessity, but also a social pattern, one that reinforces coordination and stability within a group. And when we compare this to other species, the difference becomes more apparent, as some animals may rest in groups but do not necessarily align their activity and recovery in the same way, often allowing individuals to operate more independently, whereas humans tend to share rhythms more closely, creating a situation where rest becomes a collective experience. and this shared experience can influence how rest is perceived, as individuals may begin to associate rest not only with internal signals but with the behavior of others, reinforcing patterns that are maintained across generations. And if we return again to early human life, this pattern would have supported both survival and continuity, as synchronized rest allowed for the maintenance of group cohesion, the sharing of information, and the distribution of effort in ways that reduce strain on any one individual. And over time, this would have shaped not only behavior but also the internal regulation of the body, as the timing of rest became linked to external rhythms that were consistent across the group, and this connection remains present in modern humans, even though the environments and social structures have changed, because the underlying tendency to align activity and rest with others is still embedded within the system, influencing how and when the need for rest is recognized and acted upon. And so the social dimension of human life provides another perspective on why rest appears as a frequent and recurring feature, showing that it is not only driven by internal processes, but also shaped by the patterns of interaction that define how humans move through the world together, creating a rhythm that is both biological and collective, and that continues to guide the experience of rest in subtle but persistent ways. When rest becomes part of a shared rhythm rather than an individual response, its timing begins to reflect not only the state of the body but the structure of the group, and this introduces a form of regulation that extends beyond internal signals, because individuals adjust their activity to remain aligned with others, even when their own need for rest might differ slightly, and this alignment creates a pattern in which rest occurs at moments that are collectively suitable, such as when movement slows for the group, when conditions in the environment reduce the benefit of continued effort, or when the presence of others allows for a temporary reduction in vigilance. And in early human settings, this would have been especially important, as coordinated rest could reduce risk, allowing some individuals to remain attentive while others lowered their level of activity, creating a balance that supported both recovery and safety. And within this structure, rest becomes distributed across time, in a way that is shaped by interaction, not simply by individual thresholds of fatigue, and this distribution has subtle effects on how the body experiences and responds to the need for rest, because the signals that arise internally are interpreted within a social context, where the behavior of others provides cues about when it is appropriate to pause, slow down, or continue, and over time this interaction between internal signals and external patterns creates a system where rest is both felt and learned, reinforced through repeated alignment with the group. And this can be seen in the way humans tend to follow shared cycles, such as periods of activity during daylight and reduced activity during darkness, patterns that are not only tied to environmental conditions but also to the synchronization of behavior across individuals. And when compared to other animals, the difference becomes clearer, because while many species exhibit group behavior, the degree to which humans coordinate their activity and rest across extended periods is more pronounced, reflecting the importance of social cohesion in human evolution. And this cohesion depends on maintaining a rhythm that allows individuals to remain connected while also meeting the needs of the body. And if we return again to early human life, we can imagine that this rhythm would have been flexible yet consistent, adapting to changing conditions while preserving a general pattern of shared activity and rest. And within this pattern, individuals would have experienced rest not only as a response to their own internal state, but as part of a collective movement toward reduced demand. And this collective movement would have provided the conditions necessary for recovery, allowing the body to recalibrate while remaining within the structure of the group. And this interplay between individual and collective rhythms continues to shape the human experience of rest, even in modern contexts where social structures are more complex, because the tendency to align with others remains embedded within behavior, influencing when rest is taken and how it is perceived. And this adds another layer to the understanding of why humans require rest more frequently than many other animals, suggesting that the need is not only biological but also relational, emerging from the ways in which individuals coordinate their activity across time. And so rest becomes both a personal necessity and a shared pattern woven into the fabric of human life, as a means of maintaining both internal balance and social connection across extended periods of activity. As these shared rhythms of activity and rest become more deeply embedded, the experience of rest begins to take on a dual role, where it supports not only the maintenance of the body but also the continuity of relationships. And this dual role influences how rest is structured over time, because it must accommodate both the internal needs of individuals and the external patterns of the group. And this creates a form of coordination that extends beyond simple synchronization, shaping when and how rest occurs in ways that reinforce stability across both biological and social systems. And if we look again toward early human environments, this coordination would have been present in the gradual slowing of activity at certain times, such as when light faded or when movement across the landscape became less efficient. And during these periods, rest would have emerged as a shared transition, where individuals reduced their level of engagement together, allowing the group to maintain cohesion while also providing the conditions necessary for recovery. And within this shared transition, the body could respond to its internal signals without becoming isolated from the group, and this balance between individual need and collective structure would have been essential for maintaining both survival and continuity, as it allowed for the distribution of effort and attention across individuals, reducing the strain on any one person while preserving the overall function of the group. And over time, this pattern would have shaped not only behavior but also the expectations and responses associated with rest, reinforcing the idea that rest is not simply a private event but part of a larger rhythm that connects individuals to one another. And when compared to other animals, the difference becomes more pronounced, because while many species exhibit forms of group rest, the degree to which human rest is integrated into social patterns that extend across time and context reflects a deeper level of coordination, one that supports complex forms of interaction and shared activity. And this integration has implications for how rest is experienced, as the presence of others can influence the perception of fatigue, the timing of pauses, and the ability to enter states of reduced demand. And if we consider how this pattern persists in modern life, it becomes evident that the same underlying tendencies continue to shape behavior, even in environments that differ significantly from those of early humans, because the need to align with others remains a fundamental aspect of human life, influencing not only when rest occurs but how it is valued and understood. And this influence can be seen in the way rest is often structured around shared schedules, cultural patterns, and collective expectations, all of which reflect the ongoing interaction between individual biology and social organization. And this interaction adds another dimension to the understanding of why humans require rest more frequently than many other animals, showing that the need is not only rooted in the body but also in the relationships that define how humans exist together. And so rest becomes a point of convergence between internal processes and external patterns, supporting both the maintenance of the individual and the stability of the group. And in this way, the social dimension of human life contributes to a pattern where rest is not simply an interruption of activity, but a recurring and necessary feature of a system that is both biological and collective, shaped over time by the conditions under which humans have lived and continue to live today. Beyond the shared rhythms that guide when humans pause together, there is another layer shaping the need for rest, one that emerges from the accumulation of experience over time, because the human body is not only moving through space but also carrying a growing record of past interactions. And this record is not stored as static information but as patterns that influence how the body responds to new situations. And as these patterns accumulate, they introduce a form of internal weight that must be managed, not in a physical sense alone, but in the way they affect perception, attention, and decision-making. And this management requires time, because the system must continually integrate new information with what has already been learned, refining responses and adjusting expectations. And this process becomes more complex as the range of experiences expands, which is particularly evident in humans, whose lives involve a wide variety of environments, tasks, and social interactions. And if we look back toward early human existence, this accumulation would have been shaped by the need to remember locations, recognize patterns in the environment, and anticipate changes over time, all of which required the brain to maintain and update a growing set of internal representations. And this updating could not occur effectively while the system was fully engaged with external demands, because the same processes that allow for perception and action are also needed to reorganize and refine internal patterns. And this creates a natural rhythm where periods of engagement must be balanced by periods of reduced demand, allowing the system to process what has been experienced and prepare for what may come next. And this processing is not always visible, yet it influences how clearly the body can respond to the environment, as unresolved or poorly integrated patterns can lead to slower responses, less precise movements, or difficulty in distinguishing between relevant and irrelevant signals. And these effects may appear gradually, often as a subtle sense that effort requires more concentration, or that attention is more easily disrupted. And these signals indicate that the system is approaching a point where rest is needed, not because energy has been depleted, but because the internal organization of experience requires adjustment, and when compared to other animals, the difference becomes clearer, because while many species rely on learned patterns, the range and variability of human experience create a greater demand for continuous integration, as the system must remain flexible and responsive across a wider set of conditions. And this flexibility increases the need for regular intervals, where internal processes can proceed without the interference of ongoing external demands. And if we return again to early human environments, we can imagine that moments of reduced activity, whether during transitions between tasks or during periods of lower environmental demand, would have provided the space for this integration to occur, supporting the continuity of perception and action across days and seasons. And over time, this pattern would have become embedded within the structure of the human system, shaping how rest is experienced, not only as a response to physical or immediate cognitive strain, but as a necessary phase in the ongoing process of maintaining and refining the body's interaction with its environment. And so the accumulation of experience adds another dimension to the understanding of why humans require rest more frequently than many other animals, showing that the need arises not only from what the body does in the present, but from how it carries and organizes the past, creating a continuous demand for periods of reduced activity that allow this organization to remain effective over time. As experience continues to accumulate, the process of integrating it becomes increasingly important for maintaining the clarity and stability of perception, because each new event does not exist in isolation, but interacts with patterns that are already present, and this interaction requires the system to constantly adjust how information is organized, strengthening some connections while allowing others to fade. And this process cannot occur effectively during continuous engagement with the external environment, because the same resources are needed for both responding to immediate demands and reorganizing internal patterns. And when these two processes compete for attention and energy, the quality of both can begin to decline, leading to a gradual reduction in precision and coherence. And this reduction is often felt not as a sharp change, but as a subtle shift, where attention becomes less stable, responses slightly slower, and the effort required to maintain focus increases. And these changes signal that the system is carrying more unresolved information than it can efficiently manage, and that a period of reduced demand is needed to restore balance. And if we look again to early human conditions, this need would have been shaped by the constant interaction with a complex and changing environment, where individuals had to remember locations, recognize patterns in animal movement, and adapt to shifting conditions over time, all of which required the brain to maintain and refine a growing network of internal representations. And without opportunities to reorganize these representations, the ability to interpret new information would become less reliable, as the boundaries between patterns would begin to blur, making it more difficult to distinguish what is relevant in a given moment. And this blurring would have practical consequences, affecting the timing of decisions and the coordination of actions. And so rest would have served not only to restore energy, but to preserve the structure of experience itself, allowing the system to maintain clear distinctions between different types of information. And when compared to other animals, the difference lies in the scale and variability of what must be integrated, because many species operate within more stable and repetitive contexts, where learned patterns change less frequently and require less continuous adjustment, whereas humans, whose environments and behaviors are more varied, must regularly update their internal models to remain effective. And this ongoing updating increases the need for rest, as the system requires intervals where it can shift its focus inward and reorganize without the interference of new input. And if we consider how this pattern persists in modern life, it becomes evident that the same underlying mechanisms continue to operate, even as the volume and pace of incoming information have increased, because the capacity of the system to integrate experience remains tied to processes that require time and reduced demand, and when these conditions are not met, the effects can accumulate, appearing as difficulty in maintaining attention, a sense of overload, or a reduction in the ease with which tasks are performed, all of which reflect the system's need to restore its internal organization. And so the integration of experience provides another perspective on why humans require rest more frequently than many other animals, showing that the need arises not only from physical or immediate cognitive demands, but from the ongoing effort to maintain a coherent and functional representation of the world across time. As the integration of experience continues, across days and seasons, the body does not simply store what has happened, but continuously reshapes how those experiences influence future perception. And this reshaping requires a careful balance between retaining useful patterns and allowing less relevant ones to fade, because if all experiences were held with equal strength, the system would become crowded with competing signals, making it difficult to respond clearly to new situations. And this balance cannot be maintained through constant engagement alone, because the processes that refine and reorganize these patterns require a different kind of activity, one that unfolds more effectively when external demands are reduced. And this is where rest becomes essential, not only as a response to effort, but as a condition that allows the system to maintain its ability to interpret the world with clarity. And if we look again to early human life, this need would have been present in the quiet intervals between movement, when attention could shift away from immediate demands and internal processes could proceed without interruption, allowing the brain to adjust the strength of connections, to reinforce patterns that supported successful outcomes, and to reduce the influence of those that no longer aligned with the current environment. And this process would have supported the ability to adapt over time, ensuring that past experience remained useful rather than becoming a source of confusion. And without these intervals, the accumulation of experience could begin to interfere with perception, as overlapping patterns made it more difficult to distinguish between similar but distinct situations. And this interference would not necessarily be obvious at first, but would gradually affect the precision of responses, increasing the effort required to act and reducing the reliability of decisions. And these subtle changes would have signaled the need for rest, guiding behavior toward conditions where internal organization could be restored. And when compared to other animals, the difference becomes more apparent, because while many species rely on learned patterns, the variability and complexity of human experience create a greater need for continuous refinement, as the system must remain flexible enough to adjust to changing conditions while preserving the patterns that support effective action. And this flexibility comes with the cost of requiring more frequent opportunities for rest, as the processes that maintain clarity cannot be sustained indefinitely alongside continuous input. And if we consider how this pattern persists in modern contexts, it becomes evident that the same underlying dynamics continue to shape the experience of rest, even as the sources of input have expanded, because the capacity to integrate and refine experience remains dependent on periods where external demand is reduced, allowing internal processes to proceed. And when these periods are insufficient, the effects may appear as a sense of mental saturation, where new information becomes more difficult to absorb and existing patterns become less distinct. And this reflects the system's need to restore balance, not by adding more input, but by reorganizing what is already present. And so the ongoing refinement of experience provides a final layer to this aspect of the human need for rest, showing that rest is not only about recovery from effort, but about preserving the clarity and usefulness of what has been learned, allowing the body and mind to continue functioning effectively across time. And in this way, the accumulation and reorganization of experience contribute to a pattern where rest is required more frequently, not as a sign of limitation, but as a necessary condition for maintaining the adaptability that defines human life. As the body carries not only the demands of the present, but also the accumulated effects of time, another layer begins to shape the need for rest, one that emerges from the differences between individuals across generations, because the human population is not composed of identical systems operating at the same capacity, but of bodies that change gradually over the course of life. And these changes influence how energy is used, how recovery occurs, and how signals of fatigue are experienced. And this variation creates a structure in which the need for rest is distributed unevenly, reflecting not only the conditions of the environment but the stage of life each individual occupies. And if we look back toward early human groups, this diversity would have been a constant presence as individuals of different ages moved together, each bringing a different balance of strength, endurance, and recovery capacity. And within such groups, the rhythm of activity and rest would have been shaped not by the most capable individuals alone, but by the collective needs of all members, including those who required more frequent pauses. And this collective adjustment would have influenced how often rest occurred, creating a pattern where activity was moderated to maintain cohesion, rather than pushed to the limits of the strongest individuals. And this pattern reflects a deeper aspect of human life, where survival depended not only on individual performance but on the ability to sustain the group over time. And in this context, rest becomes a mechanism that supports continuity across generations, allowing individuals at different stages of life to remain integrated within the same rhythm of activity. And this integration would have been essential in early environments, where knowledge, experience, and care were distributed across individuals, and where the presence of older or younger members influenced how movement and effort were organized. And when compared to other animals, the difference becomes more apparent, because many species operate with less overlap between generations or with more uniform patterns of activity, allowing individuals to function with greater independence, whereas humans maintain extended periods of interdependence, where the needs of different age groups are closely linked. And this interdependence contributes to a pattern where rest is not only a response to individual signals, but a reflection of the broader structure of the population, shaping how activity is paced and how recovery is integrated into daily life. And if we consider how this pattern persists in modern contexts, it becomes evident that the same underlying dynamics continue to influence behavior even as the forms of social organization have changed, because the variation in capacity across individuals remains, and the need to accommodate this variation continues to shape the rhythms of activity and rest. And this adds another dimension to the understanding of why humans require rest more frequently than many other animals, showing that the need arises not only from the internal demands of the body but from the structure of the population itself, where differences in age and capacity create a system that favors regular intervals of reduced demand in order to maintain stability and continuity across time. And so the presence of multiple generations within human groups contributes to a pattern where rest is both a biological necessity and a social adaptation, supporting the ability of the group to function as a whole, while allowing individuals at different stages of life to participate in shared activity. When individuals within a group differ in how they use energy and how they recover from effort, the rhythm of activity begins to reflect a compromise between these differences. And this compromise does not simply average the needs of all members, but often adjusts toward those who require more frequent or earlier rest. Because maintaining cohesion depends on ensuring that no part of the group is pushed beyond its ability to continue, and this creates a pattern in which rest appears not only as a response to the limits of the strongest, but as a response to the vulnerability of the system as a whole. And if we look again toward early human environments, this dynamic becomes more visible as groups move together across landscapes where distance, terrain, and changing conditions required constant adjustment. And within these movements, individuals of different ages would have experienced effort in different ways, with some able to sustain activity for longer periods and others requiring more frequent pauses. And rather than fragmenting into separate rhythms, the group would have maintained a shared pace, shaped by the need to remain connected, and this shared pace would naturally include more frequent intervals of reduced demand, allowing all members to continue participating. And in this way, rest becomes distributed across time in a pattern that reflects the diversity of the group rather than the capacity of any single individual. And this distribution influences how the body experiences rest, because the signals that guide it are not acted upon in isolation, but within a context where the behavior of others provides a framework for when to slow down or pause. And over time, this interaction reinforces a rhythm that aligns internal needs with external patterns, creating a system where rest is both individually necessary and collectively maintained. And when compared to other animals, the difference becomes clearer, because many species either operate in more homogeneous groups or rely on forms of activity where individuals can function more independently, allowing for less synchronization in rest patterns, whereas humans tend to maintain closer alignment, reflecting the importance of cooperation and shared movement in human evolution. And this alignment increases the frequency with which rest must occur, as it accommodates the full range of capacities within the group. And if we consider how this pattern persists in modern contexts, it becomes evident that the same underlying principle continues to shape behavior, even as social structures have become more complex, because differences in energy use and recovery remain present, and the need to coordinate across these differences continues to influence how activity and rest are organized. And this adds another layer to the understanding of why humans require rest more frequently than many other animals, showing that the need is not only determined by the demands placed on an individual body, but by the requirement to maintain a rhythm that supports the continuity of the group. And so rest emerges as a shared adjustment that reflects both the diversity of human capacity and the need to sustain connection across time, creating a pattern where frequent pauses are not a sign of limitation, but a reflection of how humans exist together, balancing individual variation within a collective system. As this shared rhythm continues to adapt to differences across individuals, it begins to shape not only how often rest occurs, but how it is distributed across time, creating a pattern where activity is extended through moderation rather than intensity. And this moderation allows the group to sustain movement over longer periods without forcing any one member beyond their capacity. And in doing so, it reinforces a system where rest appears more frequently, but at a lower intensity, woven into the flow of life rather than reserved for moments of collapse. And if we return again to early human environments, this pattern would have supported a mode of survival that depended on continuity, where maintaining the presence and participation of all members was more important than maximizing the output of a few, and in such conditions, rest becomes a tool for preserving stability, allowing individuals to remain aligned with the group while also meeting their own needs for recovery. And this alignment would have influenced how signals of fatigue were interpreted, as the body not only responded to its internal state but also to the pacing of others, creating a feedback loop where individual needs and group behavior reinforced one another. And over time, this feedback would have shaped the expectations associated with effort and rest, embedding a tendency toward more frequent pauses within the broader structure of human activity. And when compared to other animals, the difference becomes more pronounced, because species that rely on individual performance or operate in less interdependent groups may tolerate greater variation in activity levels, allowing some individuals to continue while others rest, whereas humans tend to maintain cohesion, adjusting the overall rhythm to accommodate the full range of capacities within the group. And this adjustment increases the frequency of rest, as it ensures that all members can continue to participate without reaching a point of exclusion or breakdown. And if we consider how this pattern persists in modern contexts, it becomes evident that the same underlying principle continues to influence behavior, even in environments that differ significantly from those of early humans, because the variation in individual capacity remains, and the tendency to align with others continues to shape how activity is organized. And this can be seen in the way rest is often structured around shared schedules, social expectations, and collective patterns, all of which reflect the ongoing interaction between individual biology and group dynamics. And this interaction adds another dimension to the understanding of why humans require rest more frequently than many other animals, showing that the need is not only a function of internal processes, but also a consequence of living within a system that values continuity and connection. And so the presence of multiple generations and varying capacities within human groups contributes to a pattern where rest is both a biological necessity and a social adaptation, ensuring that the system as a whole remains stable across time. And in this way, the rhythm of rest reflects not only the limits of the body, but the structure of the group, shaping how humans move, pause, and continue together in a way that preserves both individual function and collective continuity. When the human relationship with movement changed through the spread of agriculture, the need for rest did not disappear, but the patterns surrounding it began to shift in a quiet and important way, because earlier forms of life had often followed rhythms shaped by landscape, weather, daylight, and the flexible demands of foraging, whereas agricultural life gradually tied effort to fields, seasons, planted cycles, and repeated forms of labor that could not always be adjusted as freely to the changing state of the body. And this change did not create the human need for rest, which was already deeply rooted in biology, but it altered the environment in which that need had to be managed. And in doing so, it introduced a new tension between the body's older rhythm of variation and a newer rhythm of repetition. And this tension helps explain why rest became not only a biological requirement, but also a social problem. Because once food production depended on planted land, stored grain and recurring tasks, activity could no longer be shaped only by immediate conditions in the same flexible way, and instead, many forms of effort had to be performed at particular times, whether the body had fully recovered or not. And if we look back toward the earlier origins of human life, this contrast becomes clearer, because for most of human existence, movement had been distributed across changing spaces, with pauses emerging naturally from terrain, weather, and shifting opportunities, while the agricultural world concentrated effort into fixed places and recurring obligations, and this concentration changed how strain accumulated, as the body was asked to repeat similar motions, return to the same ground, and sustain work that was often less varied in posture and pace. And when movement becomes more repetitive, rest changes in meaning, because it is no longer only a way of restoring balance after varied activity, but also a way of interrupting the accumulating effects of repetition. And this matters for the human body because repetition places a different kind of demand on muscles, joints, and attention, creating less visible variation and therefore fewer natural opportunities for the small recalibrations that earlier forms of life may have provided. And in that sense, agricultural life did not make humans weaker, but it reduced some of the environmental variation that had once helped rest emerge more organically within the day. And when compared to many other animals, this marks an unusual condition, because humans were no longer only responding to hunger, weather, and immediate movement through a landscape, but to a system of delayed returns, where present effort was tied to future harvest. And this made it easier for activity to continue beyond the body's subtle signals, since the logic of farming often demanded persistence across longer periods of repeated work, and yet the body itself remained largely the same body shaped much earlier, still requiring pauses for neural recalibration, tissue repair, heat regulation, and the quiet restoration of coordinated movement. And this mismatch between ancient biology and changing historical labor becomes one of the central features of human rest, because the body still asked for variability and recovery, while the agricultural world increasingly asked for regularity and completion. And if we imagine early farming communities, we can sense how rest would have been reorganized by this new order, no longer arising only from the open-ended rhythm of movement across a landscape, but from a more structured cycle of labor, season, and shared obligation, where people paused not simply because internal balance required it, but because daylight ended, tools were set down, or the community moved collectively from one task to another. And this means that rest in agricultural life became more scheduled by external systems, even while its biological purpose remained internal. And that distinction matters, because it helps explain why human beings can continue to need deep recovery even in societies that appear more settled, and why a more stable environment does not necessarily reduce the need for rest, since stability in location can coincide with repetition in labor, and repetition can create its own forms of accumulating strain. And so the agricultural shift adds a historical layer to the question of why humans need rest more than other animals, showing that the answer is not only in the body itself, but also in the way different human worlds have either supported or constrained the body's older rhythms of recovery. And from this point forward, rest begins to appear not only as a biological inheritance from early human life, but as something that history keeps reshaping, sometimes in harmony with the body, and sometimes in quiet tension with it. As agricultural life deepened and daily effort became tied more tightly to fixed land, repeated tools, and seasonal obligation, the body was asked to endure a different relationship with labor, one less shaped by constant variation in movement, and more shaped by recurrence. And this recurrence altered the conditions under which rest could naturally arise, because repetition narrows the range of posture, pace, and muscular use, making it easier for strain to gather quietly in the same regions of the body, while reducing the small adjustments that once helped distribute effort more broadly. And if we look again toward the earlier beginning of human life, before fields and permanent plots, movement had usually unfolded across changing terrain, with different surfaces, different carrying demands, different rhythms of searching, watching, and walking. And within that older pattern, the body encountered variety almost automatically, which meant that rest was often woven into the day through shifts in pace, posture, and environment, whereas the agricultural pattern placed the body in repeated relation to the same motions, the same spaces, and the same obligations, and this did not eliminate the biological need for recovery, but it changed the way that need accumulated, because when similar movements are repeated across many days, fatigue is not only felt as tiredness but as a narrowing of physical options, where the body begins to lose some of its natural alternation between effort types and instead carries a more concentrated form of wear. And this concentration affects not only muscles and joints but also attention, because repeated labor demands a different kind of sustained focus, one that may seem less intense than the alertness required in open and changing landscapes, yet can still create a steady burden through monotony, timing, and the need to complete tasks that cannot easily be postponed. And this is one of the quiet historical changes that matters when asking why humans need rest so often. Because the body that entered agricultural life was still the body shaped much earlier, still dependent on cycles of recalibration, thermal regulation, tissue repair, and mental reorganization, but it now had to manage those needs within a world where work was often more repetitive and less adaptable to subtle internal signals. And if we imagine early farming communities, we can begin to sense how rest itself may have changed character, becoming more clearly divided from labor rather than softly interwoven with it, because tasks such as preparing soil, planting, harvesting, grinding, carrying, and maintaining settlement spaces tend to create sequences where the body continues in recognizable patterns for longer stretches before interruption. And when interruption comes, it may be determined less by internal readiness and more by light, season, weather, or communal timing. And this makes rest feel more externally framed, even though the reasons the body needs it remain internal. And that gap between external schedule and internal biology is significant, because it allows strain to persist beyond the moment when the body first begins to ask for reduced demand. And over time, this can intensify the feeling that rest is something one must arrive at after labor, rather than something that circulates naturally within movement itself. And when compared to many other animals, the contrast remains revealing, because animals do not reorganize their lives around stored harvests, delayed yields, and repeated ground-bound obligations in the same way, while humans increasingly did, and so human rest became entangled not only with physiology, but with systems of production, obligation, and expectation, and this entanglement did not erase the older evolutionary pattern, but layered a new historical pressure on top of it, creating a life in which the need for recovery continued to arise from deep biological causes, while the opportunity to respond to that need became more structured, delayed, or uneven, and this helps explain why more settled human life did not make the body simpler or more self-sufficient, because settlement can reduce some forms of uncertainty while increasing repetition, and repetition can make the body's signals quieter yet more persistent, building not through dramatic exertion but through steady, repeated demand. And so the agricultural world teaches something important about rest, which is that a more organized society does not necessarily reduce the need for recovery, and may in some ways make the management of recovery more difficult, because the body still seeks variation, redistribution, and intervals of restoration, even when history begins to ask it for regularity, completion, and return to the same labor again and again. As agricultural life became more established, rest was gradually drawn into a different relationship with time itself, because in earlier human worlds the timing of effort often emerged from immediate conditions such as weather, distance, animal movement, bodily state, and the changing quality of light, while in farming communities, time became increasingly organized around return, repetition, and expectation, with certain tasks needing to be done not simply when the body was ready, but when the season demanded, when the crop required, or when the household could not delay its labor any longer. And this altered something very deep in the experience of recovery, because the body still carried the older human need for variation, recalibration, and repair, yet it now lived inside a structure where effort was more often measured by obligation than by shifting terrain. And when effort follows obligation, rest can begin to lose some of its earlier fluidity, becoming more clearly postponed, more sharply divided from work, and more dependent on shared schedules that do not always match internal signals. And if we return again to the beginning of human life before farming, we can see how large this shift may have been, because movement across open landscapes naturally produced changes in posture, direction, pace, and sensory demand, while agricultural life often returned the body to the same field, the same pathways, the same storage areas, the same domestic spaces, and the same repetitive sequence of actions across days and seasons. And when the body repeats itself in this way, it does not merely become tired in a general sense, but begins to accumulate a more patterned form of strain, one that settles into familiar muscles, familiar joints, familiar attentional abbeys, and this kind of repetition makes rest more necessary in a quiet but persistent way, because the body is not only recovering from effort, it is also trying to restore variation where history has reduced it, and that attempt to restore variation matters for human biology, since the body evolved through long periods in which movement, perception, and social coordination were distributed across changing conditions, not fixed routines, and this means that the need for rest in agricultural societies may have become more noticeable, not because the human organism had changed suddenly, but because the historical environment had become less flexible toward the organism's older rhythms, and this helps explain why settled life, though often imagined as more stable, did not remove the need for recovery, and may in some settings have made recovery feel more urgent, more delayed, or more incomplete, especially when repeated labor continued day after day without enough natural redistribution of effort. And if we imagine early villages, with people returning to the same plots, processing the same materials, carrying the same loads, and organizing daily life around recurring tasks, we can sense how rest may have started to separate into more defined moments, not because the body only needed recovery at those moments, but because the structure of life only allowed recovery to fully appear there, after tasks were done, after light faded, after obligations loosened for a while, and this makes rest in the agricultural world feel historically shaped as much as biologically required, a meeting point between an ancient body and a newer system of labor. And when compared to other animals, this is again a distinctly human condition, because the human body is not only living in nature but in history, not only responding to heat, effort, and wear, but to calendars, planted cycles, shared expectations, and delayed returns. And these additional layers do not erase the biological foundations of rest that reach back toward the earliest humans, but they do reshape when recovery can happen and how the need for it is felt. And that reshaping is one reason the question of human rest cannot be answered by physiology alone, because humans do not merely have bodies that tire, they have worlds that organize when tired bodies may stop, and from this point of view agriculture marks not the beginning of rest, but the beginning of a long historical tension in which the body continues to ask for restoration according to older evolutionary patterns, while the social world increasingly asks for labor according to newer and more regular forms of time. And within that tension, the human need for rest remains, quiet but insistent, reminding us that even when history changes how people live, it does not easily change the deeper rhythm by which the body preserves itself. By the time we arrive at the modern human condition, the long pattern becomes difficult to ignore, because the body that now lives among artificial light, fixed schedules, enclosed spaces, and prolonged mental attention is still, in its deeper structure, a body shaped across far older environments. And this creates one of the quietest paradoxes in human life, since the external world often appears more stable, more protected, and more organized than the world of early humans. Yet the internal need for rest has not diminished in proportion to that stability, and in some ways it has become more visible, because the body still depends on cycles of recalibration, cooling, tissue repair, memory organization, and social rhythm, but many of the conditions that once allowed those cycles to unfold more naturally have been altered, compressed, or overridden. And if we look back toward the beginning of human life, the pattern was different not because people were free from fatigue, but because their activity was more directly shaped by changing terrain, daylight, weather, shifting tasks, and the natural rise and fall of collective movement, and within that older rhythm, pauses were often embedded in the day itself, emerging through variation, while in modern life activity is more easily prolonged in one posture, one attentional mode, or one social demand. And this matters because the human body was not built only to stop after intense effort, but to move through alternating conditions that distributed strain and allowed subtle forms of recovery to occur before imbalance became too great. And when those alternating conditions become weaker, the signals of rest do not disappear, but they may arrive in forms that feel less dramatic and more persistent, such as diffuse fatigue, heaviness of attention, reduced patience, slower recovery, or the quiet sense that effort continues but with less ease than before. And this persistence can create the mistaken impression that the body is failing to adapt to comfort, when in fact it may be responding to the absence of the very variation that once helped regulate it. Because comfort, in the historical sense, is not always the same as compatibility with human biology, and a stable chair, a lit room, a repeated task, or a socially imposed schedule may reduce certain older dangers while also increasing the continuity of specific demands. And continuity without enough redistribution is precisely the condition under which the human need for rest tends to become more pronounced. And this is why the final answer to the question cannot be that humans are simply weaker than other animals, because everything traced across the earlier layers of this story suggests something more complex and more revealing, which is that the human organism is unusually dependent on restoration because it is unusually distributed across many forms of demand at once, drawing continuously on brain, memory, social timing, heat regulation, postural control, tissue repair, and adaptive movement, and this wide distribution gives humans remarkable flexibility, allowing them to persist across climates, build shared worlds, and carry knowledge across generations. But it also means that strain rarely remains in one place, and recovery cannot be reduced to one event. And so rest becomes a recurring return to coherence, not a retreat from life, but a condition that allows life to continue in human form. And if we compare this once more with many other animals, the distinction is not absolute or simple, because all living beings require cycles of reduced demand. Yet the human cycle appears especially layered, shaped not only by muscles and metabolism, but by history, memory, cooperation, and the inherited mismatch between ancient biology and changing worlds. And perhaps that is why rest in human life so often feels deeper than mere sleep, because what is being restored is not only energy but the continuity of a creature that never functions in only one register. And if there is a quiet lesson carried through this long history, it may be that the need for rest is not evidence that the human body fell behind, but evidence that it remained open, flexible, and unfinished, always preserving itself through intervals of repair rather than through uninterrupted force. And that offers a gentler way to understand fatigue, not as an embarrassment or a defect, but as one of the oldest truthful signals the human body still gives, reminding us that survival was never built only on effort, and that a species capable of memory, endurance, social life, and historical change may have always depended on one humble act, more than it liked to admit, the act of returning, again and again, to rest. As this long pattern continues into the present, the question of rest begins to shift from why it is needed to how it is recognized. Because in a world where external conditions can be controlled or extended, the signals that once guided behavior through light, terrain, and shared movement no longer arrive with the same clarity, and yet the body continues to produce its quieter indications, shaped by processes that have not changed at the same pace as the surrounding environment. And this creates a subtle distance between what the body is asking for and what the world appears to allow, a distance that is not always obvious but can be felt in the way effort sometimes continues beyond ease, or in the way recovery seems to require more deliberate attention than it once did. And if we look back toward earlier human life, this distance would have been smaller, not because the body needed less rest, but because the conditions of life more often aligned with the body's rhythms, allowing pauses to emerge without the need for conscious negotiation, whereas now, rest can sometimes feel like a decision rather than a transition, something that must be chosen or permitted rather than something that naturally unfolds. And this change does not remove the biological processes that make rest necessary, but it can make those processes less visible, as the body continues to operate under extended demands that mask the early signals of imbalance. And over time, this masking can alter how fatigue is experienced, shifting it from a gradual guidance toward reduced activity into a more persistent background state. where the sense of needing rest is present, but less clearly tied to a specific moment or cause. And this persistence reflects the fact that the body is still managing multiple layers of demand at once, from neural processing and memory integration to heat regulation, tissue repair, and the maintenance of coordination. And each of these layers contributes its own signals, which together form a complex pattern that is not always easy to interpret in environments that encourage continuity of effort. And when compared to other animals, the difference again becomes less about absolute capacity and more about the relationship between organism and environment, because many species continue to live within conditions that align more closely with their biological rhythms, allowing rest to occur as part of a broader ecological pattern. Whereas humans have increasingly shaped environments that can extend activity beyond those rhythms, creating the possibility of sustained engagement that does not always match the timing of internal recovery, and this possibility introduces a new dimension to the human experience of rest, where the need remains constant, but the pathways to meet that need become more varied and sometimes less direct. And if we consider how this plays out across daily life, it becomes evident that rest is often negotiated within layers of expectation, responsibility, and habit, rather than emerging solely from the body's signals. And yet those signals continue to operate, quietly adjusting perception, attention, and movement in ways that encourage a return to balance. And this encouragement may appear as a gradual slowing, a shift in mood, or a subtle reduction in clarity, all of which reflect the body's attempt to guide behavior back toward conditions where recovery can occur. And in this way, the modern context does not eliminate the need for rest, but changes how it is encountered, making it less automatic and more dependent on awareness. And this shift adds another layer to the understanding of why humans require rest more frequently than many other animals, suggesting that the need is not only embedded in biology, but also influenced by how closely the environment reflects or diverges from the conditions under which that biology developed. And so rest in the present moment becomes both a continuation of an ancient pattern and a response to a changing world, a meeting point between what the body has always required and what the environment now allows. And within that meeting point, the human need for rest remains, steady and persistent, shaping the way activity unfolds even when it is not immediately recognized as such. And so, the question returns, more quietly than before, not as a puzzle to be solved once and closed, but as a way of seeing the human body more honestly across the long span of its history. Because if rest appears again and again in human life, more insistently than we sometimes expect, it may be because the human organism was never built for uninterrupted output in the first place, and never became what many modern habits imagine it should be, a perfectly steady machine that can remain clear, coordinated, socially responsive, physically stable, and mentally organized without regularly yielding to intervals of recovery. And when the full pattern is gathered together, from the earliest rhythms of life to the open landscapes of early humans, from the demands of heat and movement to the slower work of tissue repair, from the weight of memory to the timing of shared life and the structures of agriculture and modern schedules, the same truth appears in different forms, which is that the human body does not preserve itself by avoiding limitation, but by returning to balance before limitation becomes breakdown. And this may be one of the least dramatic yet most important facts about being human, because it suggests that rest is not the opposite of survival, but one of survival's oldest methods, a quiet technology of continuity carried within flesh long before tools, buildings, and institutions began to surround it. And this changes the meaning of fatigue as well, because fatigue is often treated as though it were merely a failure of will or efficiency, yet across the deeper history of the species it looks more like a signal that many layers of human life are converging at once. The brain asking for reorganization, the tissues asking for repair, the muscles asking for redistribution, the body temperature asking for regulation, memory asking to be sorted, and the social organism asking for its rhythm to soften for a while. And when those layers speak together, what is being requested is not surrender but restoration, not retreat from life but the condition that allows life to continue in recognizably human form. And perhaps this is why no simple comparison with other animals can ever fully settle the matter, because the human body is not only a body that moves, hunts, carries, and endures, but also one that remembers, anticipates, cooperates, teaches, ages across long dependency, and lives inside historical systems of obligation that no other creature constructs in quite the same way. And each of those capacities widens the field across which strain can accumulate, which also widens the need for recovery. And in that sense, the frequent need for rest may not reveal a deficit in the human design, but the cost of having become a species organized across so many layers at once, biological, social, cognitive, and historical. And there is something unexpectedly gentle in that conclusion, because it means the body has never truly been asking to do less simply out of weakness, but has been asking to remain coherent enough to continue. And coherence is a quieter aim than triumph, yet perhaps a deeper one, especially across the long arc of human time, where what mattered most was often not intensity in a single hour, but the ability to return the next day with enough steadiness to keep moving, keep remembering, keep caring, and keep belonging to others. And if this long history leaves behind any useful message, it may be this: that the need for rest is not an error waiting to be overcome, but a truthful part of the inheritance that made human life possible. And the more carefully one listens to that inheritance, the less strange it becomes that the species capable of shaping the world also remains dependent on stopping within it. Because perhaps what allowed humans to endure was never only the power to push forward, but the power to pause without disappearing, to recover without losing direction, and to begin again without pretending to be endless. And if that is true, then the old question remains open in the most human way possible, not fully answered, only deepened, because what if the creature that needed the most rest was also the creature that turned rest into memory, memory into history, and history into the fragile continuity we still call being human?